chapter 138 of the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas, we reach the point in the narrative at which Judas Iscariot betrays his master, Jesus. As is typical of this strange medieval production, the narrative in part follows the canonical models closely, although intermingling synoptic and Johannine episodes. In this section of the work, the author is following synoptic patterns, but deviates from all canonical models by the inclusion of several episodes that seem to have no precedent in the Jesus tradition, canonical or apocryphal. There is firstly a miracle of the harvest at Nain, the place at which, according to Luke's Gospel at Luke 7:11, and elsewhere in the Barnabas Gospel, chapter 42, Jesus raises the widow's son. And secondly, immediately following this, there is an episode in which Jesus and his disciples retire to Damascus. This whole section of the work seems to be of intrinsic interest to scholars investigating the formation and later permutations of the Jesus story, especially when seen in the light of recent discoveries and new developments in scholarship. The Damascus episode in particular is of considerable interest because it provides a curious parallel, albeit in a very late and very disreputable source, to the now famous sojourn in Damascus described in the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls. I want to sketch that parallel and add some further contextual considerations. In the miracle of the harvest, all the men of Nain, we're told, with the women and children, come to the house where Jesus and his disciples are staying and urge him to help them. The worms have eaten the corn, and we shall not receive any bread this year in our land, they say. At length, Jesus persuades them to fast for 19 days, and on the 20th, quote, they gathered so much corn that they did not know where to store it, and this thing was cause of plenty in Israel, unquote. The good people of Nain, however, determined to make Jesus their king, and apparently divining this, Jesus flees and his disciples cannot find him for another 15 days. When he is found, he explains that, quote, I fled because a host of devils is preparing for me that which in a short time you shall see. For the chief priests and the elders of the people shall rise against me, and they shall wrest authority to kill me from the Roman governor, because they shall fear that I wish to usurp kingship over Israel. Unquote. And he predicts in the canonical manner his betrayal by one of his disciples. Then the following day, quote, there came 2 by 2 36 of Jesus' disciples, and he abode in Damascus awaiting the others. Unquote. Here he gives a brief discourse on death. Meanwhile, Judas Iscariot, we are told, has gone to visit the chief priests, and having made his resolution, he gave notice to the scribes and Pharisees how the matter had passed in Nain. It is explained that he hoped that Jesus would become king of Israel, and so he himself would be a powerful man, but had decided to betray Jesus when his hopes were dashed. Judas, however, joins Jesus in Damascus in chapter 143, where the remaining disciples came to Damascus by the will of God. And on that day, Judas the traitor, more than any other, made show of having suffered grief at Jesus' absence. Nothing more happens. Jesus says, let us return to Galilee, for the angel of God has said to me that I must go there. They return to Galilee, and the narrative rejoins the canonical models at Luke 19:1. This is the sequence of events that turns the tide in Barnabas' story. Up until this point, as in the canonical accounts, the priests and Pharisees had conspired against Jesus, but had not moved against him. These were the events, according to the medieval Barnabas, that brought the traitor Judas to them and gave them what they needed against Jesus. In short, the story goes, Jesus performs a miraculous harvest at Nain, the people seek to make him king, he flees, his disciples find him, he predicts his betrayal, He and some of the disciples flee to Damascus. Judas, remaining behind, consults the authorities. The remaining disciples arrive in Damascus, and then they all return to Galilee. The issue of kingship is central. The miracle of the harvest is one of the episodes that Canon Ragg, who translated the Italian manuscript of the Barnabas Gospel into English in the early 1900s, described as being among the more intriguing and worthy passages in the work. The story may be based on Malachi 3:11, or more significantly 1 Samuel 12:16, where Samuel says to the Israelites, when conceding to anoint Saul king, quote, "Is it now wheat harvest, is it not? I will call on Yahweh, and he shall send thunder and rain. Consider then and see what a very wicked thing you have done in the sight of Yahweh by asking to have a king." Unquote. The direct canonical basis for the episode, however, seems to be John 4:35. Quote, "Have you not got a saying, 4 months and then the harvest?" Unquote. In Barnabas, Jesus asks the people of Nain, "How long is it until the harvest?" Unquote, directly echoing John. That they gathered so much corn and they did not know where to store it appears to be a motif taken from or related to Luke's story of the rich man who had so much corn he did not know where to store it, Luke 12:16. The article of the story in which Jesus goes missing appears in turn to be based on John 6:15. In John's Gospel, Jesus retreats to the hills by himself because a crowd of followers wants to make him king. Quote from John, "Jesus could see that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, so he escaped back to the hills by himself." Unquote. The parallel to this in the Synoptics, Mark 1:35 and Luke 4:42, is where Jesus quietly leaves Capernaum, makes his way to a lonely place where, according to Luke, the crowds went to look for him, but where, according to Mark, Simon and his companions set out in search of him. According to Luke, Jesus explained that he had to move on to continue teaching in Judea, according to Mark, in Galilee. As usual in the Gospel of Barnabas, we are at a loss to chart the exact permutations of canonical and non-canonical elements that have gone into constructing the extant text. One of the difficulties is that the permutations of narrative and canonical sources alone defy a precise delineation. Reference to external sources and external events presents some suggestive parallels but not conclusive models. There is a very odd parallel to these configurations of narrative in Josephus's Jewish War that deserves attention. He relates the story of one of his many messianic pretenders, Simon, noting the appearance of that name in Mark, who has a, quote, "village called Nain," unquote, as one of his strongholds. He was obeyed even by respectable citizens, Josephus says, like a king. Outside of the Gospel of Luke, this is the only ancient reference to a Nain, although the biblical Nain is in Galilee, while Josephus places it far to the south. The really curious section of the narrative, however, is the sojourn in Damascus. This seems to have no basis in the canonical Gospels at all. Mark has Jesus propose, "Let us go elsewhere to the neighbouring country towns so that I can preach there too," Mark 1:38, and Luke has him saying, "I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns too," Luke 4:43. But Jesus does not go to Damascus. In John, the episode that follows Jesus' escape into the hills from those who would make him king is the walking on the water at the Sea of Galilee, John 6:16, followed by the discourse in the synagogue in Capernaum, 6:22. Jesus goes as far north as Tyre and Sidon in the canonical stories, but not to Damascus. In Mark, he also visits the region of the Decapolis, but not specifically Damascus. In fact, Damascus is never mentioned in the canonical Gospels at all. and in none of the apocryphal Gospels with the exception of the Gospel of Barnabas. It does feature as a significant place, of course, in Acts of the Apostles, and the immediate source of Barnabas's idea that Jesus went there may come from reports of a community of Christians in that city in Acts. Thus was Saul on the road there to persecute the followers of the way in Acts 9:2. It is possible that the author of Barnabas has made good an apparent omission in the canonical accounts by placing Jesus and his followers in Damascus, a place known from Acts to have been a Christian centre. This may even be connected with the strongly anti-Pauline character of the Gospel of Barnabas. There are other points where the work seems to be countering Acts and its portrayal of Saul Paul, and the official version of Christian origins. The whole premise of the medieval Gospel of Barnabas is that it is written by Paul's erstwhile companion Barnabas to correct the Hellenistic and pro-Roman errors into which Paul had fallen. In such an anti-Pauline work, given the importance of the road to Damascus in Orthodox portraits of Paul, it is conceivable that the author is hoping to make a point about Paul by presenting his very Judaic or Ebionitic Jesus in Damascus. If so, the author's point is unclear. As already indicated, nothing actually happens in Damascus. Jesus and a portion of his followers go there. Jesus says a few words about death, then no sooner have the other disciples arrive and they return again to Galilee, and the text returns to canonical models. The interlude in Damascus seems to have no particular point, except perhaps that Jesus' absence from the land gives Judas an opportunity to confer with Jesus' enemies. In the small amount of scholarship applied to the many mysteries of the medieval Gospel of Barnabas, little is said about this Damascus episode. Typically, commentators will simply point to it as another instance of the work's errant geography. The vast bulk of secondary literature on the work has a polemical intent coloured by Christian Islamic disputes, and most of it is written from a Christian apologetics perspective. In such commentary, the fact that Jesus goes to Damascus is simply proof that the medieval author did not know his stuff, because we know from the canonical accounts that Jesus did not go to Damascus. It is only recently that some scholarship of substance has been applied to these issues. In particular, a number of scholars conducting their research in Spain, seeking out the earliest attestations of the medieval Barnabas, have drawn attention to the works of the Morisco writer Juan Alonso. Alonso reproduces many of the doctrines of the Gospel of Barnabas in a manuscript now in Madrid and dated around 1612. He does not refer to the Gospel by name, but there are undoubtedly similarities between his work and the point of view propounded in the Gospel. And he relates a peculiar story about a certain King Jesus of Damascus. It is supposed by some scholars that Juan Alonso or some member of the Morisco community composed the Gospel of Barnabas as a fraud, the purpose of which is unclear, and that Alonso's story of King Jesus of Damascus is the immediate source of the work's story of Jesus' visit to that city. There can indeed be little doubt of some connection, noting for instance the continuation of the king motif, but the exact relationship between one story and the other is far from obvious. Other than the connection by name, King Jesus of Damascus, Alonso's story bears little resemblance to the Barnabas story. Alonso's story, in fact, is a crude reworking of the tragedy of Oedipus Rex, and is finally a very different type of story that has little literary relationship to the Barnabas tale. Alonso says that the Jesus who was crucified, as opposed to the true Jesus, was a King Jesus of Damascus, who was in Judea doing penance for inadvertently marrying his mother. Can this be the source of the Barnabas story? The evidence demonstrates no more than that Alonso was influenced by the Gospel of Barnabas, indirectly, since he does not mention the work by name, and also, as well as points of view in common, has many points of view radically at odds with it. Or at most, that the Gospel of Barnabas shares a certain world of ideas with some Morisco writers in the early 1600s, although no clear and certain relationship has been established. Alonso's strange Oedipal story of a King Jesus of Damascus deepens rather than illuminates the mystery. Can it be unrelated to the Gospel of Barnabas story? If it is related, how, other than by a coincidence of title, king, name, Jesus, and place, Damascus? So from where did the Barnabas author get this episode? What precedents for it are there in earlier sources? Where are its roots? A parallel, or at least a family resemblance, does present itself in the so-called Damascus or Zadokite document found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in two incomplete medieval copies of the same document belonging to the Karaite sect of Judaism discovered in Cairo in the late 19th century. There, in what we now know to be related texts, we have the story of the righteous teacher who leads his followers into the land of Damascus, as well as the story of the teacher's betrayal by the liar or the wicked priest. Evidently, this wicked priest is evidently one of his followers, or at one point at least an ally. As soon as the Damascus document was found among the Qumran texts, and the Karaite manuscripts were shown to be ancient works from the dawn of the Christian era and related to other sectarian tracts, commentators began to suggest some relationship between its story and the story of Jesus and Judas in Christian sources. Needless to say, no certain connection has been demonstrated, but there is a clear typological similarity. Central to the story of the Christian sect and the Qumran sect is a drama of betrayal. The similarity is reinforced, moreover, by descriptions of both sects being described as followers of the Way and by the advent of a new covenant in both cases. Most appraisals of the Dead Sea literature place it sometime before the arrival of Christianity, and the whole thrust of mainstream scholarship has been to deny any identity between the Qumran sectarians and the Christians. But this still leaves open the possibility that the Christian story owes a debt to the Qumran story. Scholars are less inclined today than they were in the past to dismiss the Qumran sect as an obscure, unimportant group on the fringes of ancient Judaic religion with no connection to anyone or anything. Rather, it seems they were at least representative of certain trends in Second Temple Judaism, and it is now widely admitted that themes, ideas, and vocabulary found in the Dead Sea Scroll literature have found their way into Christian works, if only because they were in the air. If there is no direct connection between the nascent Christian sect and the followers of the Way at Qumran, the Qumran sect is at least recognized as foreshadowing many aspects of what became Christianity. It is possible, therefore, that the story of the betrayal of Jesus by Judas is one of the elements in the air at the time, that when the time came to write the life of the great Christian righteous teacher, founder of the new covenant of the Christians, the pre-existing story of the Qumran righteous teacher helped shape the Christian narrative. Again, this is not to propose any identity between the two, it is merely to suggest that the later story was influenced by the earlier, and to say that there is consequently a resemblance between them. If we admit this, then we are in the position to see the version of the story in the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas as bearing an even closer family resemblance because, unlike the canonical Gospels, it includes not only the general shape of a betrayal story, but the important detail of the sojourn in Damascus. The important thing to note here is not merely that Barnabas has Jesus go to Damascus, but that this journey to Damascus, Barnabas makes the pivot of the betrayal story. If the journey to Damascus had occurred at some other point in Barnabas's narrative, we would have much less of a case. But as it is, Jesus' journey to Damascus occasions the betrayal. A natural and uncontroversial reading of the Damascus document, along with other sectarian documents from Qumran, is that the righteous teacher leads his followers to Damascus, which is a safe haven for persecution by a wicked priest and betrayal within by a liar, a man of lies, or a scoffer, possibly all designations for the same villain. In the Gospel of Barnabas, it at first seems that Jesus flees to Damascus to escape the citizens of Nain and their desire to make him king. In fact, as he explains to his disciples when they find him, he flees to Damascus because he has received foreknowledge of Judas's betrayal of him and of the persecution that will soon descend upon him. If the story of the canonical accounts has similarities to the story of the Qumran literature, the story in the medieval Barnabas has an even stronger similarity. One point of textual evidence adds weight to this. It becomes clear in the short discourse on death presented by Barnabas' Jesus that Damascus is, for Barnabas and his followers, a place of exile. "Tell me, brethren," Jesus says to his followers, quote, "is this world our native country? Surely not, seeing that the first man was cast out into the world into exile, and there he suffers the punishment of his error. Is there an exile who does not aspire to return to his own rich country when he finds himself in poverty?" Unquote. Is this world our native country? The cause of this question and its underlying metaphor is that Jesus and his disciples are in Damascus, not their native country. Is there an exile who does not aspire to return to his own rich country? It is clear that Jesus and his followers are exiles in Damascus. Jesus is using their status as exiles as an opportunity to teach his followers that life itself is a period of exile, and consequently death is not to be feared because it is a returning home. For the people who wrote the Damascus document and related Qumran texts, their sojourn in the land of Damascus was a period of exile too. If the author of Barnabas has drawn the general idea that the followers of Jesus resided in Damascus from Acts of the Apostles, the notion that Damascus is a land of exile cannot easily be drawn from canonical sources. Acts would have us believe there was a settled Christian community in Damascus. Only in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Medieval Gospel of Barnabas is Damascus explicitly a place of exile. This idea is not explicit in Juan Alonso's fanciful tale of King Jesus of Damascus either. The idea of exile is perhaps an implicit feature of the original Oedipus story, but if anything, in Juan Alonso's story, King Jesus leaves Damascus to go into exile in Judea. Clearly, in the Gospel of Barnabas, Jesus leads his followers into a period of exile in Damascus, and this within the context of the betrayal. This is surely in the same family of stories as those told of the righteous teacher and his followers.